Hello, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. We had a great sign up for today's webinar. So as people are filing in, I've got a few quick notes to run over. You may have noticed before that Carl Groves was scheduled to present today's webinar, but he had a little transportation issue. And so he asked our accessibility training manager, John Watson, who's on here today, to take his place. John, I lost my train of thought there. So accessibility training is what John does on a daily basis, and he's provided training support. At this point, we were trying to figure it out, but well over 100 different organizations in the 6 years he's been with us. So he is very well equipped to talk to us today about the requirements and the best practices for implementing successful accessibility training programs. John, if you could jump to the next slide, just a few quick housekeeping notes from me. Live captioning is provided today by a third party, so you can access those using the closed caption feature in your control panel. Also, we are recording today's session, and within 2 to 3 business days, we will be sending to everyone who registered the recording, the slides, and the transcript from today. Also, we will save Q&A until the end, but you are welcome to drop in questions in the Q&A as we go along, as you have them. You don't need to wait until the end. And then we'll address them in the order they come in. But we do ask that you use the Q&A feature for that in your control panel versus chat if you can, because it just helps us and helps the presenter track those questions better. And that's it, John. I will turn it over to you for the good stuff.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today's session. I'm excited to be here. I'll try to do my best to fill Carl's very capable shoes. But in terms of introduction, my name is John Watson. As Kim mentioned, I've been with Level Access for 6 years, and most of my time at Level Access has been focused on training. So as you can imagine, in 5 years, I've gained a few skills and anecdotes to share around what makes a successful training program. So we're going to get right into it here. And this session, I expect that I'll have about 30 minutes worth of topics to cover, and then we'll move into questions and answers from there, give or take a few minutes. But as Kim mentions, do queue up your questions if you have any. We'll get to those shortly. And the Q&A feature is available there for you to drop those questions in. I do notice, Kim, that we have a raised hand here. Are we able to unmute folks, or is that not possible here? That could have been a mistake.
Yeah, I don't believe we are able to unmute for speaking, but I would just ask if anybody is a hand raiser, if you want to drop a note in the chat. I can, if you've got a question or something, or if you're having an issue, I'm happy to keep an eye on the chat. Oh, see, it was a mistake after all. Happens to all of us. Yep. All right.
All right. So let's go ahead and dive right into our topic for today. So we're going to be talking about accessibility education for employees. And I want to start here by addressing accessibility and DEI programs more broadly. So as part of their investment into their diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI programs, some of the top companies in the world are turning to training and education to help them comply with regulations around accessibility and to help make their company a more inclusive place. We actually saw a lot of the drivers and motivations for accessibility and especially training around accessibility prior to the year 2020 as being driven primarily by compliance goals, by legal matters, which is an extremely valid reason to focus on accessibility and by extension, inclusivity in the workplace. But since the year 2020, we've seen a pretty significant shift. And that shift is towards DEI more generally. And part of DEI really comes down to meeting our goals of inclusivity and accessibility. So I have a quote here from an executive order that was made on June 25th of 2021 by President Joe Biden, saying a growing body of evidence demonstrates that diverse, equitable, inclusive, and accessible workplaces yield higher performing organizations. And I have to give it to Mr. Biden here. He's absolutely right. We at Level Access have seen evidence to this over many, many years, which is that accessibility not only helps us to meet our compliance and legal requirements, but it also yields higher performing organizations, organizations that have a better outlook on inclusivity, organizations that offer better products, more usable products, that reach a wider market, and that in the end tend to profit much more than their counterparts that don't have such a commitment. So accessibility has a wide range of benefits, and I'm not going to go into what all of those are today, but I often like to say that accessibility is about inclusivity, and this often begins at the top levels of the organization. So that's going to be a theme that you'll see coming up pretty often, repeatedly throughout this session, that we want to start with good top-down support. I hope that I have a few VPs, executives, maybe even some people at the C levels of their organization who have joined me today. But if not, if you're mid-level or any other type of position, feel free to share this information, which is that when it comes to setting up your organization for success in terms of accessibility, we want to think about top-down support, and we want to get commitment from that highest level. And this quote here from President Biden surely addresses that top level of support. Another thing I'll mention regarding DEI, we saw lots of lip service towards DEI in the year 2020. And while we've seen many organizations follow through on those commitments, we've seen many who have not, right? And that's not to say that the commitment or the willingness to meet those DEI initiatives is not there, but sometimes it's the funding that falls through, or sometimes it is not being able to understand properly what that means in practice, right? To set up a accessibility or inclusivity training program. So that's what we're here to talk about today, and I'll give you some notes from my experience. But generally, we cannot say that we're meeting DEI goals if we're not meeting our accessibility goals. Inclusion starts and ends with including everybody, and that really means including people with disabilities. So the challenge. What is it that most organizations are being challenged with when it comes to meeting those DEI goals and accessibility requirements? Well, we often find through research that accessibility training is a critical missing piece of those commitments, right? Accessibility training is sometimes treated as an afterthought, or not treated as a critical piece of DEI programs. Accessibility training, as we're going to come to see, can involve a small amount of micro-learning or a really robust program of live instructor-led sessions. There's quite a lot of different formats that accessibility training can take on. But it's not always the first thing that organizations think of when it comes to accessibility. More often, they may think about tooling, they may think about testing, or they may think about remediation, right? Those are some of the services that here at Level Access we deal with regularly, but we're seeing more and more organizations come to me at Customer Education and my great team to address their training needs, because more and more HR departments and product teams are increasingly seeking training. So there's a great set of organizations out there, a lot of different approaches to accessibility training that we'll cover in just a few moments. But another problem that is often the cause of just a more narrow viewpoint is that accessibility efforts can often be centralized or siloed. For example, those efforts will only exist within a certain team within the organization. For example, they may be directed at web developers only. However, accessibility is really a team effort that needs buy-in across the board, and really a focus on the human impact, right? Accessibility, while it's a set of technical requirements and compliance is a huge portion of that, in the end, it's about how a person is experiencing a product, a service, or a system. So a focus on the human impact is generally a really great place to start. Next, leaders lack the individual bandwidth, and I should paraphrase this by saying many leaders, not all leaders, but some leaders lack the bandwidth to address accessibility needs, which is often the result of a focus on short-term goals, or a focus on compliance, or like we said, a focus on an individual team's learning and not the cross-functional learning that's necessary to really build a greater level of education across multiple teams. And lastly, the challenge that I think is actually the most common one here is that many people just don't know how to get started, right? You're faced with training sometimes hundreds or thousands of people, depending on the size of your organization, training everyone on a set of fairly, should I say, obtuse topics, right? The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, while they are, basically the biblical equivalent of what accessibility experts are going to reference, they tend to be quite obtuse because they are not easily approachable. They're very technical, and it can be very daunting for a lot of people to understand where to begin, right? So a game plan on where to get started, how to introduce training over time, and how to measure the success of that training and that investment, those tend to be some of the biggest challenges that people face. So how you start depends on how you're structured already. Ideally, training would be set up through your HR department. But if you're a smaller organization that doesn't have anything established, there are plenty of options. The best might be to have a third party do it for you. Right? Even larger organizations sometimes tend to lack the internal expertise, which is why it might be best to leverage that expertise from a third party. And I can say from experience that this is true of small startups. This is true of enterprise Fortune 100 level organizations. It doesn't matter what the size is. The level of accessibility maturity is something that needs to be developed over time and baked into the DNA of the organization. So we often say that HR is one of the gateways for accessibility education, because HR tends to focus on those DEI initiatives, and that I is very important, right? Inclusivity remains the inclusivity of everyone, race, gender, sexual orientation, and disability, right? Now, I haven't listed every type of identity category, but disability here is one that often gets overlooked in a manner that some of the others do not quite so often. Also, we might think about our existing learning methodologies, whether that's an LMS or if that tends to be something else. But if your company has an LMS, look for someone who supplies learning or education within it, or offers some type of subscription package. A good vendor should be able to provide a curriculum that is congruent to the way you currently educate your employees. Essentially, follow the game plan for setting yourself up for success with any type of effective training. So make it part of your regular employee education process. First, confirm whether training is needed. Conduct an analysis, right? Get an understanding of where people's current skills lie and where those lacks are. For smaller teams, this may allow you to focus on certain areas more than others. With larger teams, this tends to show where those trends are and allows you to focus on the areas or invest in certain areas more than others. Larger teams tend to benefit better from learning management systems, from self-paced education, so that they can take it on at their own time, especially teams that might be scattered throughout the globe. However, smaller teams might benefit more from in-person training or one-on-one mentorship. So an analysis will help us understand where training is needed and what type of training we should go forward with. This will also help us to understand the learners themselves, their levels of expertise, their motivations, and their learning styles. Not everyone learns the same way. We want to ensure that we are offering a variety of methods or techniques to diversify those offerings and to ensure that people are learning the way that suits them best. On the next slide, I'll explain some of those different types of training as well as the pros and cons. But this might take on the form of a knowledge base, a webinar style, a self-paced curriculum, or in-person training. Setting goals that align with the organizational strategic goals can be really helpful in this regard. So if our DEI goals name a specific level of compliance with accessibility or with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, then we may want to incorporate training that focuses on meeting that end of year goal. Note that accessibility, like pretty much any type of major initiative, it's not something that we're going to achieve overnight, nor is it something that we're going to achieve in a short period. We want to think long term when it comes to setting goals. Maybe this begins with general awareness and proceeds towards understanding how people with disabilities interact with web content or digital content more broadly before we go into that more technical area. So our goals should be realistic. We shouldn't set our goals to immediately have everyone learning some of those highly sophisticated or technical solutions, but rather to gain that general awareness so that teams can align on their common goals. And then in evaluating a training team, you do want to look for certain qualities, ensuring that the trainer is knowledgeable, prepared, and personable. Of course, going with any reputable third-party accessibility consulting organization is generally going to point you towards trainers that are well-versed, not only in the subject matter, but in how people learn and in ensuring that those goals are met effectively. So to summarize, make it part of your regular employee education process by offering a range of different training and learning solutions. This can include immediate trainings, onboarding paths, annual updates and or refreshers, as well as long-term training plans. As I mentioned, there's a variety of training types. And while I tend to focus many of my efforts on webinar style or in-person training, there's tons of benefits to knowledge bases and to self-paced training as well. And I actually think that that's a direction that we're heading in more, right? In-person was great before 2020. I spent years flying around the country and visiting organizations and creating those bonds with people and having those interactions with learners is priceless. And I hope this doesn't go away. But webinar style has really introduced a whole range of flexible solutions for people who tend to learn pretty well from the comfort of their own home, as well as have the benefit of being behind their computer and to be able to look things up and to follow along and save resources as they're learning. So some of the pros and cons. Let's start up at the top there with knowledge bases. Knowledge bases are great resources if they are used, right? And they tend to offer consistency in training. A knowledge base can generally point people towards real-time information that they need for the particular problems that they are facing, right? So we can insert links into our project plans, into our definitions of done that point to knowledge bases, that point to component libraries or pattern libraries. This is a consistent manner to constantly refer back to those best practices. One of the cons of knowledge bases tends to be that they lack customization. So they won't always necessarily speak to the direct needs of the team, but rather to general knowledge. Self-paced learning courses tend to be a little bit more customizable in that we can build courses for different paths, paths for different roles. So a content creator or a UX designer or a developer can all have their own self-paced journey. One of the pros of this is the ability to revisit that content whenever necessary. Some of the cons, however, tend to be with retention and with compliance, right? Once we've walked through some self-paced training, it's not always the case that we're going to apply what we've learned right away. So retention is one of those issues. Webinar style training gives people the opportunity to ask real-time questions and to join from anywhere. So definitely a type of training that has been growing in popularity since 2020 and possibly will continue that trend as we embrace a more remote digital world. Asking questions of the instructor, that interaction tends to promote better retention, tends to promote better understanding. However, as with any type of virtual meeting, people might have a tendency to show up and tune out, especially if those training or webinar style seminars are not exactly interactive. It can be pretty one-sided. Whereas in person allows for a lot more interaction. I'll often say that eye contact with a learner is one of the best ways to evaluate whether they are learning or not. So in-person training remains a very important method of training, especially if we can find the budget, find the space, the event space. However, the cons there tend to be disruption to daily workflows, and logistically, it's a little bit more challenging. So what do we need to train people on? What are the main topics that a good accessibility education program is discussing? Well, on screen here are a few of those. I have ADA, WCAG or WCAG, and I have ARIA. ADA, of course, standing for the Americans with Disabilities Act. WCAG standing for, as I said, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. ARIA, a more advanced topic for developers generally, accessible rich internet applications, techniques that developers and engineers really need to know to ensure that their products are meeting the highest level of accessibility. These are the foundational topics that are almost always included in any worthwhile accessibility training program. This touches on legal and compliance. This touches on guidelines and best practices. This also touches on some of that advanced level technical remediation or customization. However, one of the reasons that companies tend to struggle with accessibility is that they might have a pretty narrow understanding of what a robust accessibility training program should look like. In other words, they may underestimate it. They may believe that they have enough to implement a program, only to realize that there's much more to it than originally believed. So in other words, it's okay, if not preferred, to start at the 101 level. And I can't tell you how important this is. With all the different organizations that I've worked with over the years, I've had a lot of people who love to skip that introductory or that 101 level of training, often for good reasons, saying, you know, our team has a pretty good foundation, a good understanding of accessibility. We don't need to know the why. We don't need to learn about the benefits. We have the buy-in. Let's get straight into that advanced level training. And almost every time we do this, we tend to have to incorporate some of that 101 level training back into our curriculum because that's generally where people still tend to struggle, right? And that's totally normal, right? We're going to need that refresher from time to time. We're going to need to start at the beginning to understand where inclusivity begins and to understand what those common patterns are that people with disabilities are often struggling with. How do people use assistive technologies? What are the main challenges and how do we overcome them? That's all 101 stuff that is really, really beneficial to teams, even those that have a lot of experience with accessibility. They tend to find those introductory courses to still be really valuable. So companies often believe and diving right into the advanced training because people might have existing or prior knowledge about accessibility. But the simple truth is that the majority of people lack knowledge in the foundational components of accessibility. Another approach or issue might be that companies often believe that they need high-level customized training programs, but rather than starting with a training in the fundamentals, this should definitely be a prerequisite, even if you think that you're beyond that point. So it's important to understand the underlying principles of how people with disabilities interact with technology, in addition to the main tenets of accessibility training itself. This can involve training on regulations, answering some of these fundamental questions, such as how do the Americans with Disabilities Act and the CVAA, the 21st Century Communication and Video Accessibility Act, and Section 508 apply to your job function, right? If you are a video editor, or if you are a web page developer, or a UX designer, which of these laws or regulations are actually relating to my job function? And how do I gain that awareness for what I need to do and what someone else needs to do? Another training topic that we focus on pretty regularly and that I believe is really essential to a good accessibility training program is an understanding of how people with disabilities just interact with technology, right? First of all, what are those disabilities? We don't, as a society, talk about disability very often. It's something that we try to limit our discussion of, right? Because it's sometimes uncomfortable, to be honest, to talk about disability. But it's uncomfortable really generally for people who don't have those disabilities. For people with disabilities, it's uncomfortable not to talk about it, right? Now, of course, there's etiquette, and there are certain manners that we can have constructive discussions around disabilities so that it's not just an expose of challenges, but rather a deeper understanding of how people's conditions manifest and how we could be more sensitive towards those different lived conditions. So gaining a foundational understanding of disability types, and if I say low vision, what would that mean, right, for you as a designer? Well, that would mean that you have an understanding of how people with low vision might see content, right? Will it be blurry or will it be spotty? Will they need to zoom in or will they need to change the fonts or colors? What are some of the ways that low vision manifests so that we can be better prepared as product managers or product designers to anticipate those needs and those interactions with assistive technologies? So assistive technologies, screen readers, screen magnifiers, switch devices, voice recognition tools, just to name a few. Gaining a deeper understanding of how those assistive technologies work are really, really going to enhance our overall understanding of accessibility. So this is putting everything into context so that we can then lean into the accessibility guidelines and techniques and success criteria to be successful. Now, I promise this is not a plug for Level Access's Academy, but I do want to share just a few words on this particular product. We built Access Academy to allow professionals to get trained for free on the topics that we believe should be part of any accessibility training course. So Access Academy helps you to build the skills to improve accessibility processes without disrupting your business. Since everyone learns differently, Access Academy is designed to help your teams adopt and retain accessibility skills in a way that works for them. So there's a lot of different approaches to training. We've spent years developing an approach with a system that is going to really prioritize on-demand, need-to-know basis for the benefit of a whole range of different roles. For example, some of the courses and options available in Access Academy include Introduction to the ADA, the CVAA, Section 508, and WCAG to gain that compliance-minded orientation, disability awareness and etiquette as another example of where we need to begin before we can start doing the actual hard work of applying the accessibility guidelines to our processes, glossaries of accessibility terms to gain that deeper understanding and familiarity, and then some very role-specific courses around creating accessible emails, for example, or writing meaningful alt text, things that touch on just about every role within an organization. We are all sending emails, right? We are all generally building documents. And so understanding how we can do a better job of ensuring that those emails are being presented in an accessible manner, how alt text in those documents or embedded within those emails are enabling everyone within the organization, including those with blindness or who use screen readers, to better understand that content. This is what it means to be more inclusive. So expanding our narrow reach towards more teams is one of the best ways to ensure that we are meeting, a more robust set of training needs. This means not focusing just on the technical aspects of accessibility, but considering the importance of every person and every role in making a more accessible company, making a more accessible products. Companies are increasingly compelled or focused on delivering accessibility training to employees, specifically across digitally focused teams. So this might include product managers, particularly in relation to design elements, UX and UI designers who should stay up to date on WCAG AA accessibility standards, which are constantly evolving every few years. We tend to get additional success criteria. WCAG 2.2, for example, is slated to be published later this year. And so those are also great opportunities to introduce more training. QA, ensuring that the work that QA teams are doing is the most efficient and productive. What are the right tools that are helping QA analysts and QA engineers to identify accessibility issues, to report on them, and to move efficiently through that testing process? Content creators, particularly those that focus on document and PDF creation and remediation, as well as some of those considerations around alternative text and writing good copy. I always find that accessibility can be really synonymous with good copywriting. And so having content creators exposed to accessibility skills and training can go a really long way to enhancing that overall user experience. Legal teams should stay up to date on ADA and WCAG. WCAG, again, which is constantly evolving, putting in place robust accessibility policies and training programs can help to generally offset any type of legal risk. And then procurement officers should generally have a good understanding of what to look for from other companies when they're procuring software or any other third-party tools, right? We don't want to set up our company as one that is inclusive in every way, but then purchases or procures third-party software that doesn't meet our rigorous accessibility standards. So knowing what to look for when we're procuring those tools is vital to meeting that highest level of inclusivity. So the law itself focuses on reasonable and equal access. So if you focus only on compliance, you're missing the idea that those are discrimination-based laws. Your goals should be more aligned around inclusivity, and that's how you really meet your compliance goals. So in other words, focusing on standards and requirements is like focusing on the roadmap and ignoring the final destination. Ultimately, the focus should be on inclusivity. This includes inclusivity in how we hire, inclusivity in how we interview, right? Inclusivity in terms of how we structure teams, as well as inclusivity in how we position and promote and market our products. Another way to see it is that training is a key preventative measure that can help us to meet our short-term and our long-term goals. Generally, short-term goals include making fixes to our existing products to achieve ADA compliance. Fixes, by the way, tend to be more burdensome, more challenging, more expensive than to preventing issues in the first place, which tends to be our goals, our long-term goals, right? Educating employees so you don't have to do this again in the future, that you can begin an inclusive design process that puts accessibility at the forefront of our product development process and prevents any issues from being introduced down the line. And so the fundamental goal really should be to build accessibility into your daily DNA. Fix your existing problems or gaps in processes, anticipate or eliminate problems before they arise, get your training and tooling into a streamlined process to ensure widespread compliance in the long run, ensure that all of your designers know how to design with inclusivity in mind, and empower the evangelists to further your goals. Again, training is not just about focusing or siloing in on a particular set of individuals or teams, but really building it into your daily DNA, your company's values, and considering how this impacts everything from ideation through to release. And so with that, we're going to open the floor here to questions. Thank you everyone for joining, for spending this time. We have up until the end of the hour to go over questions. So I'm going to pass it back over to Kim, who's going to moderate the questions and answers. I know some may have to come in through the chat, but you can also use the Q&A function.
Yeah, they're rolling in now. The first one we've got, I don't know if you're able to see it when you're sharing the deck, but they asked, do you think changing DEI to IDEA is going to be more globally used or even more standard the way that DEI is now?
So to be totally frank, I've never heard IDEA. I do imagine that the A here stands for accessibility. And to that end, I would say, that is a word that should be on the tip of our tongues. And it is a word that we should be passing around more often. So DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We do think about inclusion and accessibility often in the same breath, but they are different, right? Inclusion is about ensuring that we have set up the processes and the approaches to ensure that everyone is able to perform their job functions and participate in that workplace or with that product or that service. Whereas accessibility is ensuring that the tools and the methods for interacting with those products and services are available. And so I think that's a great one. Yeah, IDEA, as we might come back to President Biden's statement here, we have diverse, equitable, inclusive, and accessible. And it doesn't pass over me that the president here used that term accessible, didn't really stop short to use that term. And so I do hope that that's a more embraced term in the future.
For sure. Hey, I'm going to jump over to one from chat. This person asked, does Level Access Academy, or Level Access is Access Academy, produce training certificate of completion?
We've recently introduced this new product. Access Academy was introduced just a few months ago, and we've been building towards a more robust set of product offerings and courses. The certificate I know is in that roadmap, and if it's not available yet, then it will be soon. So I know that was a core component. And as Valerie mentioned, thank you, Valerie, there are badges, right? So those badges will be produced by the system, but certificates, I believe, are coming at a later date.
Great. If you're probably able to see this, but Valerie also asked, do you have any suggestions on handling the overwhelm that comes up when folks see this full scope of accessibility? That's a great one.
Yeah. So that is definitely one of the biggest challenges that a lot of people tend to focus on when it comes to setting up an accessibility training program, or to getting that organizational buy-in for accessibility. I know what you mean, because I often feel overwhelmed when I think about the whole set of accessibility guidelines and success criteria that we have available. My advice is to start small, right? And sometimes that means not even bringing the guidelines into the conversation until we feel confident in our understanding of why accessibility is important. And there's a lot of reasons, right? Just to focus on a few, it increases usability. It increases engagement and interaction. Accessibility also tends to lower costs and sets us into compliance, right? So those are just a few of the main benefits. Once we're familiar and comfortable with that, and comfortable with understanding how people with disabilities interact with the web using different assistive technologies, then we can go about learning what those guidelines are. There's a lot of resources that help to make those guidelines more understandable. One of the ironies I often say of the web content accessibility guidelines is that they are not always very accessible, right? They tend to be very technical, very compliance driven, almost legalistic, and that's for obvious reasons, I think. But we'll start small. We'll start with alt text. We'll start with labeling elements properly, and really understanding how that might impact a keyboard-only user, how that might impact a screen reader user. A really great mentor of mine, you may have heard his name, Derek Featherstone. He would always say to me that the place to start for accessibility is with keyboard, images, and forms. KIF, he called it KIF. Keyboards, images, and forms. And I would expand images to think a little bit more about non-text elements in general, not just images, but any non-text element that is an essential part of the UI, making sure that we have proper labels on those elements, that they are keyboard accessible, and then spending a good amount of time focusing on the accessibility of our forms, since forms tend to be one of those challenging areas for all users, regardless of their accessibility needs. So to create a really pleasant, accessible form experience and meeting the best practices related to forms, that can take us a long way in creating a better user experience and then building from there, right? Colors tend to be a pretty easy one to address. And so any type of overhaul that might be necessary to address color contrast concerns, other aspects of visual design like using headings, that's also very important for the benefit of assistive technology users.
Great. I have one more that came to me directly in chat. It's kind of long. Let me read this. Do you have any tips or strategies that companies can use to help ensure employees are retaining what they learned in accessibility training and are actually using and implementing that information in their daily work?
Mm-hmm. So that tends to be an area that that can be challenging, right? Measuring skills learned over time, especially when we have a lot of turnover or a lot of shuffling between teams. So what we have in Access Academy is a set of courses that are designed to increase that retention by being constantly available and by giving real-time solutions. Quizzes and tests, these are usually fun ways to engage people and to test that retention. Most of our courses won't allow you to complete them until you've answered a set of test questions correctly. So those are some of the e-learning solutions. When it comes to other types of training, such as webinar-based, we might think about how we are checking in with participants at a regular interval, whether that be a couple weeks following the training or a couple months, either with sort of that quiz format or just to collect general feedback, like what do you remember? How have you included this into your work? What are some areas that you continue to struggle with? Just those open forums can help us to set up our next steps, because training is generally never a one and done thing. At a minimum, I think it should be a yearly, something that we revisit yearly. But a combination of instructor-led and e-learning solutions can really help to bring that progress a little further. And one more thing I'll say is that at Level Access, and with most organizations, most third-party organizations that offer accessibility services, we can often use our accessibility management platform, also known as AMP, to measure the overall compliance of a product or a system. So those compliance scores, we'll generally look to those, and this is over years, right? Not 1 week to the next, but over years, as we continuously evaluate products against accessibility standards, we can often see where those improvements lie. Now, that's not going to only be a result of training. That's often also going to be a result of tooling and a result of many other factors. But training can often be considered one of those factors that can contribute towards greater compliance.
Excellent. All right, we've got another good one from Valerie. Valerie's on fire today. She asks, have you had any success or worked with clients that have used gamification to roll out or encourage training? And do you know if they saw a positive effect from it?
So I can't say that I have noticed any or spoken to any clients who've used gamification elements. I love gamification. I think it is an excellent way to increase engagement and just to make things more fun. But to this point, I haven't seen any stories that really speak to that from an accessibility training perspective or from a training perspective in general. However, I'd love to explore that topic further because I think it would be a really great way to enhance engagement.
For sure. Susan said, we are considering buying Academy for my company. Once everyone goes through the courses, do you feel there's a benefit to long-term access to Academy? Will there be updated and new trainings added over time?
Yes and yes. So Academy is a subscription-based service, and so it's you're going to have access to it regardless of how you how you want to approach training, whether it's over a short blitz or over a longer period. I think the minimum subscription term is 1 year, but we are constantly adding new courses. And it's the news is out at this point. Level Access has merged with Essential Accessibility. And with that comes a breadth of additional knowledge from their learning platforms that we're going to be incorporating into our own. So suffice it to say that the Access Academy, think of it as like LinkedIn Learning. You wouldn't necessarily go into LinkedIn Learning and learn everything on the platform in a week and then cancel your subscription. You might, but you're more likely to keep that subscription running because more content is coming, because adjustments are being made, edits are being introduced. So that's how we like to position Access Academy. Plus, it's a very useful resource for people who are recently onboarded, right? And to catch them up to speed on some of the training that other employees have had the benefit of running through already.
Excellent. I was going to say, but correct me if I'm wrong. I think that also, in addition to on-platform training courses, Access Academy subscribers also, they have weekly webinars, I think, on a lot of basic topics, live webinars every week.
Absolutely. Kim, thank you so much for that reminder. As the training manager, that should have came to mind as well. I do believe that it's only some subscription types that gain that access. I'm not great with like the product features and subscription levels. That's a question for someone like Kim. But you're absolutely right. We do also offer weekly or bi-weekly training sessions, live webinars such as these ones that are actually a lot more focused on specific accessibility topics that might range from visual design considerations to accessible documents to compliance and procurement to just some of those general topics like introduction to accessibility and assistive technologies that I mentioned earlier. So that's also a very good benefit, I would say, of Academy, because it's not only that on-demand role-based on-demand, self-paced training platform, but it's also a set of premium content that's delivered by accessibility experts who do teach private sessions regularly.
Excellent. Well, it looks like we do not have any more questions. So, hey, thank you to everybody that is still hanging in. So glad you could join us today. John, thank you so much for coming in today on this last minute. I mean, we're just lucky to have another person on the team that knows this stuff inside and out. But anything else you want to add, John, before we jump off?
I mean, I'm really grateful to everyone for showing up today, and for being there, even though Carl might have been the person that you were looking forward to hearing from. I know Carl will be back in the future, but thanks again. It was a great opportunity to get to talk about training, especially from my own perspective, as someone who's been engaged in this area for years now. I hope to see more of you in some of our level access customer education led training programs in the future. So thanks again, and looking forward to working with you again soon.
To watch the full presentation, click the link in the description below.